This is a 1987 Buick Grand National, and it is one of the coolest cars of the 1980s. It was based on the boring old Buick Regal that they sold from 1978 to 1987, but this was no Regal. It was really a muscle car, and it was a subtle performance car that you didn't realize was fast until it was beating you. And today, I'm going to review it. First, a little overview of the Grand National. I've borrowed this one from a viewer here in Orange County, California. Now, like I mentioned, the Grand National was based on the regular old Buick Regal, which came out in 1978. And you could get the Regal as a coupe or as a sedan. The Grand National came out in 1982, but the original version was really just an appearance package more than anything else. But later, as time went on, they added more performance. The performance came from a 3.8-liter turbocharged V6, which was a very unusual engine back when this car was new. Even though turbo V6s are common now, they really weren't back then. Now, in 1984, the Grand National had 200 horsepower. Buick bumped that up to 235 by 1986, and then they added another 10 horsepower for the 1987 model year to get to 245, and torque was a healthy 355 pound-feet. But most people think those numbers are all wrong anyway, that the Grand National was underrated in horsepower from the factory because the Corvette at the time made 250 horsepower, and General Motors reportedly had an edict that no performance car could have more power than the Corvette. The best version of the Grand National was undoubtedly the GNX, which was a limited edition high-performance version made only in 1987. Now, the GNX was insane. Magazine tests at the time found that it was faster in a straight line than the Lamborghini Countach. Think about that. Imagine if Buick today made a high-performance version of the Regal that was faster than the Aventador. It was just that crazy back then, too. Now, this is just a regular Grand National and not a GNX, but there's hardly anything regular about it because this car is just such an icon in the automotive world. So today, I'm going to take you on a tour of it, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the Grand National. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a DougScore. And for more of my thoughts on the Grand National, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of some of the best preserved 1980s cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Grand National with a discussion of its logo. One of my favorite things about this car, it had this cool yellow and red circle logo that turned into an arrow, and that was intended to represent a turbocharger since this car was turbocharged, and that was a cool and unusual thing at the time. Now, something I never realized about the Grand National's logo that the owner told me, it was also intended to represent a 6 because this car had a V6, so you can see it's like arranged to look like a 6 and a turbocharger to mean Turbo 6. Now, the logo appears in several places on the outside of the car. Obviously, this fender badge is the most prominent. The logo also appears on the wheels. You can see it here in the wheel centers, and it appeared on the trunk lid at the back of the car, but that was it. The Grand National was actually fairly subtle in terms of badging, and it was fairly subtle generally in terms of styling upgrades and updates over the regular Regal. You also had this little badge on the hood that says 3.8 SFI Turbo, which gave you a clue that it was something different from a standard Regal. And the Grand National had different wheels from the standard Regal. They were a little bit more aggressive, kind of angry looking, in keeping with its sporty character. And the Grand National also had just a little subtle spoiler on the trunk lid to let you know it was something different. Other than that, this car looked a lot like the regular Buick Regal. It was a very subtle performance car, which I've always liked about it. It was kind of a sleeper. One other important distinguishing feature on the Grand National is the fact that they were all black. You didn't really have a color choice if you wanted to get one of these, and I think the black color combined with the boxy lines of the Regal combined with the small changes they made to the Grand National gave this car kind of a subtle muscle car look that I absolutely love. Now, next up, a couple of other interesting items on the outside of the Grand National, unrelated to its upgrades over the Regal. One is the third brake light. Now, beginning with the 1986 model year, the US government mandated that all cars have 3 brake lights, 2 in the back and then 1 positioned somewhere in the middle. Most automakers put it in the rear window, and it's always funny to see how car companies responded to this. If they were already making cars that didn't have 3 brake lights, they just stuck it in there as an afterthought, and this car is no exception. You can see they just kind of tacked it on and they were like, well, we've complied with the regulation. The other interesting exterior item with this car is the side mirrors. Look how tiny these are. Unbelievably small. GM used these side mirrors in a lot of vehicles in this era, and it's just incredible to see it today. No one would put a side mirror in a car this small, but safety wasn't a massive priority for General Motors or anyone back in the 1980s. Now, next up, starting to move inside the Grand National, of course, the first thing you must do is open the door, and when you open the door, you can see on the door sill that it says Body by Fisher. Not Grand National, not Buick, not General Motors, but instead the company who makes the bodies has their logo there, which is like unthinkable now. Every automaker has their brand name there and it lights up. But back in the 80s, the 70s, GM was putting Body by Fisher there. I guess the company who made the bodies negotiated that probably into their contract. Now, next we move on to the interior of the Grand National. And oh, is it a quirk fest in here? But I want to start with just the general interior design of this car. It's boxy, and I mean really boxy. Cars today are so swoopy, they have nice curves inside. Not this. There are right angles everywhere. Every panel, every button, every switch, if it isn't square, then it's inside something a little larger that is square. Everything in this car is right angles, squares, and rectangles, with the sole exception of the steering wheel. It's just crazy to look at all this and think about how this was only 30 years ago that this was car interior design. Things have changed rather rapidly since. Next up, moving on to some of the Grand National's other interior quirks and features. This car has power windows, which is nice. It has power door locks, which is nice. It has power seats, which is nice, but it does not have power mirrors. Instead, you see this little mirror control on the driver door panel? Well, there's a cable attached to that control going to the mirror. You move the control and the mirror moves as you move it. So you're thinking, well, how does it work on the passenger side? Well, inside of a rectangular panel in the rectangular gauge cluster area, there is another little joystick you can move. It says right mirror, and as you move it, it adjusts the positioning of the right mirror, just like over on the driver's side. Pretty simple, sort of the easy way to adjust mirrors in the days before true power mirrors. Now, next up, I want to talk about logos in the interior of this car, which is kind of an interesting subject, and I want to talk about maybe the most interesting logo, which is the one right in the middle of the steering wheel. You can see that is the Buick logo, which isn't particularly interesting. This is, after all, a Buick, except for the fact that that is the only place that the Buick logo appears on this entire car. It says Buick in the grille, it says Buick over on the passenger side of the dashboard, but the logo itself appears only that one place because they were trying to put the Grand National logo in all of the other spots. And they succeeded in doing that in several places throughout the interior. I love that it has the Grand National logo on the headrests, on the seat backs. It looks very, very cool, embroidered in there. You also have the Grand National logo over on the passenger side of the dashboard. Again, it says Grand National with a little checkered flag, and it looks cool. And then also reminding you that you're driving a Grand National, inside the highly rectangular gauge cluster area, there's a badge that says Turbo 3.8 liter. With liter, strangely enough, spelled like the British way of spelling it, R-E instead of E-R. Not sure why, but that badge is there, and that's it. Those are the only Grand National badges in the interior of this car, which is impressive because when you buy a modern performance car, there are AMG or Focus RS or whatever badges all over the interior. Buick didn't really go that far with this one. Now, speaking of logos, I want to talk about one other logo-related item, and that would be the seatbelt buckles, which I love because they say GM in the middle. You push the GM logo to release the seatbelt. And I bring this up because GM put these seatbelt buckles into all General Motors vehicles in this era. And rather than make different buckles for all the brands, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, some cost cutter at GM was like, I have an idea. Let's just make it say GM. And so all GM buckles from this era simply say GM, probably to save 7 cents for not putting the individual brand logos on the seatbelt buckle. Now, next up, I want to move back to the rectangular gauge cluster, and specifically I want to talk about the rectangular speedometer, which is actually arranged horizontally. Now, one interesting thing about this speedometer is it only goes up to 85. So you see that and you think, well, how could this be a performance car if it only goes 85 miles an hour? Well, the answer is it doesn't. That was the speedometer from the Regal. They just kept it and put it in the Grand National. The owner of this car told me the top speed is governed somewhere around 120, 125 miles an hour. It can go way over 85, but General Motors didn't want to develop another speedometer, so they just stuck this one in there. And the owner told me when you get it up to 85, the speedo needle kind of wants to keep going off the edge, but it can't. There's nowhere else for it to go, so it just kind of pegs there. Now, below the speedometer, you have a couple of other interesting gauges. One is the tachometer, which is very unusual. It's also arranged horizontally, but it's very small, and it has these yellow and orange bars that light up as you hit various engine speeds. The yellow is sort of the in-between ones, and then it lights up orange every time you hit like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Very unusual, interesting to see that. The RPM gauge is just so small. Now, below the RPM gauge, you have the turbo boost gauge, and when you get into the turbo boost, that also lights up horizontally like the RPM gauge above it. Very interesting. Now, one other interesting item in here, to the right and to the left of the rectangular speedometer area, you have these two vertical rectangles. These have all like the warning lights for the car, letting you know the alarm is on, there's some engine problem, whatever. But I especially like when you turn the turn signal, if you turn on the right one, it doesn't just turn on the arrow, it says RT turn, letting you really know that the right turn signal is on. Put on the left one and LT turn comes on. Again, not just showing the arrow, but really confirming which signal is on in case you were confused. Now, next up, I want to move on to the sun visors for this car, which are rather interesting. I'm going to start over on the passenger side. You can see the visor is cloth, no surprise. And if you put it down, you have this big plastic mirror assembly. And then on top of that plastic mirror assembly, there's more cloth. Who knows why? They didn't have enough money to stick a Buick logo on the seatbelt buckles, but they had extra cloth lying around to put it on the plastic that's already on the cloth visor mirror. But anyway, you open up the visor mirror and you can see that it's lighted, which is a very nice touch, and it's adjustable. So you can look at yourself in dim or bright light at your choosing. Now, next I want to move into the center of the interior in the Grand National, and specifically the center console between the seats. We start in this furthest back position, and you have a little storage area here. It only tilts toward the driver. It was a nice driver-focused thing. You move up from that, and you have the shift lever, which is just this really old school shift lever. Amazing. They all came like this back in the day, but it's hard to believe now in this era of weird modern electronic shift levers that it was ever just so simple, but it was. Now, moving up from the shift lever, next you have the stereo, which isn't that unusual, fairly common stereo in 80s GM cars. I like the fact that you have 4 presets and they're unlabeled. You just kind of had to remember which was which. My favorite thing about the stereo, though, is the speakers. You can see the speakers say on them concert sound. And not just concert sound, actually, but concert sound 2. This was an upgrade over concert sound 1, and they wanted to let you know it. Over on the left, you have the climate controls, which are not especially interesting. They look just like most car climate controls from this era, again, in a little rectangular box. But the most interesting thing about the climate controls is the vents themselves, and specifically the fact that there is an extra vent underneath the steering column and underneath the gauge cluster. This was the crotch vent, the crotch cooler. You could have cold air kind of blowing in between your legs, and that was why they installed it there. It was actually a pretty decent idea, and I've heard people asking automakers to bring it back. GM had it in the 80s. Now, next we move on to the glove box, where you will find one of my very favorite quirks or features of this car, and that would be the coin storage slots. Take a look at this. On the lid of the glove box on the inside, it's actually labeled which coins you're supposed to put in which slots. But unlike a lot of cars where you can stack the coins, in this car you have to like put them next to each other, which means you can't really stick all that many coins in there. The owner and I counted it. It seems you can get about $1.55 total in your glove box if you fill up those coin slots. That was all you needed back in the 80s. You drove your Grand National to a phone booth to make a call, and $1.55 was more than enough at the time. Now, speaking of the glove box, there are several interesting pieces of literature found in the glove box, my favorite of which is this. Buick called this the stereo listening manual, if you needed a manual to listen to the stereo. And on the front it says, designed in sound, you'll love it, too much to leave it. You'll be enjoying your speaker so much you won't want to leave. The interesting thing, though, about this little booklet is it lists every single radio station in the country, gives their frequency, and gives their call sign. This was accurate as of 1987, and you can scroll through it and see every little town in the country and every radio station and frequency that exists in that town. This is a very impressive relic from Buick in 1987. Now, another interesting item found in the glove box is this little warning label, which is the label that recommends premium fuel, but it also recommends your oil change interval. In fact, it says that it is extremely important, underlined in red, to change your oil every 7,500 miles in order to maintain proper turbocharger unit operation. They made sure everybody got one of these so you knew when to change your oil and what fuel to put in your Grand National. The other interesting thing in the glove box is the owner's manual. And in fact, the owner's manual for this car is just the regular Regal owner's manual with the Buick logo embossed onto it. And the most interesting part of this owner's manual is just how short it is. It's almost unbelievable, actually. When you don't have infotainment systems and all sorts of technology in cars, you can explain everything in like 50 pages. And Buick did. And next up, this car has back seats and 2 doors, and so, as usual, I must climb into the back seats. I've moved the front seat all the way forward, and you kind of push the seat back forward, and you get in. It actually goes so far forward, there's a decent amount of room back here. And once you climb into the back seats, you'll find that there's not all that much interesting, as you might expect. This was just a fairly standard back seat with not too many frills, although it is worth noting that all the Grand Nationals had these cool two-tone seats, black on the outside and sort of silver gray in the middle, and that carried through to the back seats, which was a nice little touch. The other interesting thing in the back seats, probably the most interesting thing, is the fact that there was an ashtray only on the back of the driver's seat, and it isn't centered. I guess they figure if they were only doing one ashtray, they should move it over toward the passenger seat so both rear passengers could access it, and so that's what they did. It's a little bit off center. But the interesting thing about this particular ashtray is it still has the label on it from the factory that says this seat was made by the North Unit Cushion Room on the day shift at the Flint Assembly Plant in Michigan. That is so cool. The original label that they stuck on there for whatever reason in the factory, you probably won't see that again in any other car. Now, next we move back to the outside of the Grand National, and specifically we move on to the trunk. You open it up and you will find that it's a fairly standard trunk, although it is quite large, larger than what you would get in a lot of modern cars. You could stick a lot of stuff back here if you wanted to. A couple of interesting things about the trunk. One is that the spare tire just kind of sits here. No attempt is made to conceal it, stick it under the car, put some carpeting over it. It's just there, which again is unthinkable by modern standards, but it's what they did back in the 80s. Another interesting item in the trunk is on the top, on the trunk lid on the inside, you have this label that gives every single option code and production line number of part and feature that was added to this car, which is very cool to see. It's also very cool to see it preserved so well. And one easy way to check to make sure a car like this is original and hasn't had like the trunk lid replaced is to see that this label is still sitting here and still in good shape, because that means it was put on at the factory and it's still in its original condition. And next and finally, we move under the hood in the Grand National, which is quite an interesting place to be. This car is so different from modern cars. There's just no plastic covering or anything under here. You can really see everything. And that includes a couple of Grand National logos, actually. On the underside of the hood itself, it says Buick turbocharged, and then it has the largest Grand National logo on the whole car, reminding you what you're working on while you're working on it. There's also a little Grand National logo by the hood latch at the very front. Now, another interesting thing here, you can see right in the middle you have the turbocharger, and next to it is the intercooler, and there's an intake that sucks up air directly into the engine, as there is in a lot of turbocharged cars. Now, in modern cars, you have intakes very conspicuously mounted on the outside of the car, on the roof, on the sides, to look cool and special. In this car, it's mounted below the entire engine. It's getting air down there, further proving just how subtle this car is. It didn't need any really obvious intake showing off. Instead, it's at the bottom. You can't even see it unless you go looking for it. And so those are the quirks and features of the Grand National. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Grand National. This is so cool. I have always wanted to drive one of these. And I know it probably isn't gonna feel like a modern supercar, whatever, but I don't really care. Sitting here in this interior already, you just think, this is just so different from, you know, today's cars. It really does surprise me that this was only 30 years ago, because it just feels like it feels like another planet of car. All right, I'm gonna get in here real quick, eh? Whoa, that's actually, that is actually reasonably quick. The turbo spools up. It actually feels reasonably fast, which surprises me. I wasn't really thinking that it was going to. You know, you think the car's 30 years old, it's really not gonna feel all that fast. It actually feels good. I think actually its limiting factor seems to be the transmission. It's a shame. It's got this like old school, you know, 4-speed auto, whatever. Of course it does. All cars at that time did. But one wonders if you put in a nice transmission, would it be a lot quicker? Whoa! Drops down a gear there. Now it's moving. Whoa! That is actually reasonably quick. I'm surprised. It's fun. It actually feels fast and fun. The owner of this car told me an amazing story. He said he had a brand new Corvette in 85, 86, 87, and he was driving around, and a guy pulled up next to him in one of these and, you know, beat him at a red light off the line. And he flagged the guy down and was like, "What is that car?" And he was so surprised, the owner of this one, he's so surprised he went out and bought one new back then. And this is his second one. It's quite a story. I guess that's kind of what Buick wanted, but it's such a sleeper. Nobody really knew, and if you weren't really in tune in the business, you didn't maybe know that they were even making it, and so it's just a Regal. Well, you know, it isn't. This car doesn't have a lot of engine noise, and in fact, a lot of cars from this era don't, even V8s. What this car has, it's quick. This is surprisingly quick. What this car has is turbo noise and pounds of it. There's a lot of turbo noise. When you press it, you can really hear it kind of spool up and do its thing. Sitting in a stoplight in this car, it feels really nice, surprisingly smooth. The owner of this car told me he maintains it with this guy named Lou Scarsnata, who's like the guru of Grand Nationals. And there are some upgrades, reliability and smoothness upgrades to kind of make it a more livable car in 2019. It's a surprisingly nice cruiser. There's a reasonable amount of room here. You can kind of put the seat back. Of course, there's no real headrest because whiplash hadn't been considered 30 years ago. It drives fast enough and it's fun, and I think it's kind of an exciting car. Now, obviously, the steering is not quite on the level. You know, you can do like 2 or 3 inches left or right before anything occurs. This is not intended to be an autocross type car or anything like that. This was kind of a straight line fun drag racer type car back in the day. And it still feels surprisingly quick. I think that old school turbo lag where it spools up and then you're at the high end of the rev range, the engine's making all the noise, it slams you in the next gear, you really feel it. It's a very thrilling thing. And so that's the 1987 Buick Grand National, one of the automotive icons of the 1980s, a car that everyone still loves and respects more than 30 years later. Really nice examples of the Grand National are now selling for $100,000 or more as this car becomes more desirable, more collectible, and more sought after. And now you can see why. And now it's time to give the Grand National a DougScore. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Grand National just looks so cool, so mean without being over the top, maybe the best ever example of how a subtle, sleeper, fast car should look, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Handling is fine, but not especially inspiring, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is about average. It's fun in a straight line, but otherwise not particularly thrilling, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and these may may not turn everyone's head, but you park this next to a 570S at Cars and Coffee, and I'm walking up to the Buick. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a weekend score of 26 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's reasonably well equipped for the time, but by modern standards, it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is fine, about what you'd expect, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is okay, materials are average, and it's ultimately a 1980s GM car, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a 4-seater coupe, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value, and I think these are undervalued. Even as they're starting to increase in collectability and prices are rising, they're still kind of a bargain for how cool and special they are, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 22 out of 50. Added up, and the DougScore is 48 out of 100, and here's how it compares with some other cool 1980s cars. It can't touch the exotics, but it's closer than you might think, as it's aged better than cars like the Ferrari 348. The Grand National isn't the best performer ever, but it's just cool, and I love it. The Grand National was based on the boring old Buick Regal that was sold from 1978 to 1987, but this was no Regal. It was a subtle something or other. And so that's what it says, which is rather odd to see and think about in today's something or other.